Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The salvage records would later state that Commander Orrin Kael died of decompression exposure in the outer rim of the Kepler 442 system. They would be wrong about the manner of his death, but not about the location. What they could never document was that death, in Kael's case, had been merely the beginning of something far more profound and terrifying than simple mortality. The story begins 3 weeks before the discovery, in the grimy cantina of Nexus Station, where desperate salvagers gathered to trade stories and chase leads that might pay off their mounting debts. Kael sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of synthetic whiskey that tasted like regret, and staring at a datapad displaying his bank balance. The number glowed red, indicating debt that would take a lifetime to repay through legitimate salvage operations. At 43, Orrin Kael carried the weight of too many failed expeditions in the lines etched across his weathered face. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, in the outer colonies, the salvager who pushed too far, who chased legends instead of profitable scrap, who lost crews to his obsessions with the impossible and ancient. The Prometheus Station incident had cost him his salvage license for 2 years. The disaster at the Vale Nebula had resulted in 3 deaths and a criminal investigation that had cleared him legally, but destroyed him professionally. The expedition to the Crimson Drift had been his last chance at redemption, and even that had ended, with his crew abandoning him on a backwater mining station with nothing but his ship and his mounting debts. The Eidolon Reach was all he had left, a modified Helix-class deep space vessel that had seen better decades. Her hull bore scars from a dozen encounters with space debris, stellar phenomena, and things that defied classification. The ship's AI had been replaced so many times that its personality shifted unpredictably between helpful assistant and sardonic critic, depending on which backup personality matrix was running at any given moment. Kael's quarters aboard the ship resembled a museum of impossibilities collected from the dark corners of the galaxy. Crystallized bones from the extinct civilization of Xerium Prime hummed with subsonic frequencies when the ship's engines were running. Metal fragments, recovered from the phantom wreck, cast shadows that fell in directions that defied the laws of physics. Stones from the Whispering Moons seemed to bend space around themselves, creating visual distortions that made observers dizzy if stared at too long. Each artifact represented a discovery that should have made him wealthy, but which had instead attracted the wrong kind of attention from authorities who preferred that certain things remain undiscovered. The crew of the Eidolon Reach consisted of 2 people desperate enough to work with a man whose reputation preceded him like a plague warning. Lorraine Holt had signed on 6 months ago, fleeing debts of her own and a past she refused to discuss. Her ice blue hair was a genetic modification popular in the outer rim colonies, and her piloting skills were exceptional enough that she could have found work anywhere, which made her presence aboard Kael's ship all the more mysterious. She flew with the precision of someone who had been trained for military service, but her records showed no such background. Draven Morik was their engineer and systems specialist, a quiet man whose cybernetic implants glowed softly blue in the ship's ambient lighting. Half his face had been replaced with synthetic skin, following an accident he never discussed, and the neural interfaces surgically embedded in his skull allowed him to commune with ship systems in ways that bordered on the supernatural. His past was as carefully hidden as Lorraine's, but his skills with both conventional and exotic technologies made him invaluable on expeditions that often encountered equipment of unknown origin. They had been drifting through the dying Kepler 442 system for 18 hours when the long-range scanners detected the anomaly that would change everything. The system itself was a graveyard of worlds, 4 planets, stripped of their atmospheres by a dying star that had expanded beyond its habitable zone millions of years ago. The innermost world was a ball of molten rock. The second had been scoured down to its metallic core. The third and fourth worlds were frozen spheres covered in ice so thick that any oceans beneath would be under pressures that could crush diamond. It was the kind of system that attracted salvagers looking for rare minerals and archaeologists searching for evidence of extinct civilizations. Kael had come here following a lead from a drunk trader on Nexus Station who claimed to have detected unusual energy signatures while running contraband through the system's outer asteroid belt. The trader had been too intoxicated to provide reliable coordinates, but he had insisted that whatever was out there was bigger than a moon and older than God. Kael stood at the bridge's observation deck when the scanners detected the anomaly, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he studied the holographic display that materialized above the central console. What the instruments showed challenged every assumption he had about what was possible in the cold depths of space. Floating in the system's outer ring, beyond the orbit of the farthest frozen world, was a humanoid figure of impossible scale. The body was oriented as if floating face up, in an invisible ocean, arms spread wide, and legs slightly bent as if the giant had simply decided to rest among the stars. The proportions were perfect, too perfect, as if some cosmic sculptor had crafted an ideal human form and then scaled it up beyond the limits of physics or reason. "Lorraine," Kael called without taking his eyes from the display. "Come look at this." Lorraine Holt moved from the pilot station with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of her adult life in variable gravity. Her ice blue hair caught the bridge's amber lighting as she joined him at the observation deck, and when she saw what the scanners had detected, her usually controlled expression cracked slightly. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "How big is it?" Draven Morrick looked up from his engineering station, cybernetic implants flickering as he processed the incoming data through his neural interfaces. 67 kilometers from crown to heel, he reported, his voice carrying the flat affect that indicated he was accessing information directly through his cybernetic enhancements. Mass approximately 2.3 times 10 to the 15th kilograms. Commander, this thing has its own gravitational field. Weak but measurable. Kael felt his pulse quicken in a way he hadn't experienced since his first deep space salvage operation 20 years ago. This wasn't some random debris field or abandoned space station. This was something unprecedented, something that would rewrite the textbooks on xenoarchaeology and astrobiology. "Enhance resolution," he ordered. "I want to see everything." The holographic display sharpened, revealing details that should have been impossible to resolve at their current distance. The figure's skin appeared to be composed of some dark, crystalline material that reflected starlight in subtle patterns. The surface was cracked like volcanic glass, but the fissures followed anatomical lines, muscle definition, circulatory systems, even what appeared to be neural pathways, were visible as raised ridges across the massive torso. "It's not a statue," Kael said, though the words seemed inadequate to describe what they were seeing. "No," Draven agreed, his implants flickering more rapidly as he processed additional sensor data. "Spectral analysis indicates organic compounds, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and trace amounts of elements that don't match anything in our databases. The molecular structures are unusual. Some of the chemical bonds shouldn't be stable under normal physical laws." Lorraine turned away from the display to face Kael directly. Her expression had shifted from awe to something approaching fear. "Commander, I've been with you for 6 months. I've seen what happens when you get that look in your eyes. The Prometheus Station, the Veil Nebula, the Crimson Drift Expedition. 3 crews that barely made it home, and some of them didn't make it home at all. "This is different," Kael replied, but even as he spoke the words, he recognized the familiar fire building in his chest, the same obsession that had driven him to push beyond safe boundaries throughout his career. "Look at those proportions. Perfect anatomical structure scaled up beyond anything we've ever encountered. This isn't some random space debris or ancient sculpture. This is a body. A dead body floating in space," Lorraine emphasized. "Whatever it is, whatever it was, it's been out here for God knows how long. We should transmit the coordinates to the Science Consortium, collect our finder's fee, and get the hell out of here before something goes wrong." But Kael was already moving toward the tactical display, his mind racing through approach vectors and landing sites. The body showed signs of massive trauma, wounds that appeared fresh despite the apparent age of the corpse. The largest visible injury was a jagged gash across the torso, its edges torn as if something had ripped through the flesh from within. The opening was easily large enough to accommodate their ship, possibly even large enough for them to explore on foot. "Plot an intercept course," he ordered. "Take us to that chest wound." "Commander." "That's an order," Pilot Holt. The journey to intercept the floating giant took 6 hours at maximum safe velocity. As they drew closer, the true scale of what they were approaching became increasingly overwhelming. By the time they reached visual range, the body filled their entire forward viewport and extended beyond the edges of their view in every direction. The skin appeared to be composed of some material that wasn't quite mineral and wasn't quite organic, something that shared properties of both while belonging fully to neither category. Dust and debris from the system's asteroid belt swirled around the figure in complex patterns, but none of the material ever settled on the surface. Instead, the particles seemed to follow invisible currents that spiraled around the body before being flung back into space, as if the giant existed in its own isolated pocket of reality that rejected contact with foreign matter. "I'm reading an atmosphere," Draven reported, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Thin but breathable. Oxygen, nitrogen, trace amounts of argon, and carbon dioxide. Temperature is holding steady at -2 degrees Celsius across the entire surface. Commander, this thing is maintaining its own micro-environment." The chest wound gaped before them like the entrance to a cathedral built for beings that dwarfed human imagination. Its depths disappeared into absolute darkness that seemed to swallow their ship's external floods, but their sensors detected structural formations within, chambers, and passages that suggested this was far more than a simple corpse. This was architecture on a scale that challenged the fundamental assumptions of biology and engineering. "Take us in," Kael ordered. Lorraine's hands hesitated over the controls. "Commander, my instincts are screaming at me to turn around and run. This whole situation feels wrong. It's like the thing is watching us." Kael followed her gaze to the distant head of the giant, where features that could have been carved by divine hands waited in apparent repose. The eyes were closed, but something about the set of the features suggested not peaceful rest but suspended animation, as if the giant was merely sleeping and might wake at any moment. "All the more reason to investigate before it has the chance," he said. "This could be the archaeological discovery of the millennium, evidence of life on a scale we never imagined possible. We could be looking at proof that intelligent life existed in this galaxy millions of years before any of the known civilizations." Lorraine engaged the maneuvering thrusters, guiding the Eidolon reach through the wound's opening and into the giant's interior. Their external floods revealed walls lined with what appeared to be fossilized muscle tissue, each fiber as thick as an ancient tree trunk, and arranged in precise anatomical patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so fundamentally disturbing. Bioluminescent veins threaded through the tissue like a vast circulatory system, pulsing with faint blue-green light in rhythms that almost resembled a heartbeat. "I'm detecting trace electromagnetic activity," Draven said, his instruments painting readings across his screens that challenged his understanding of physics. "Whatever this thing is, it's not completely inert. There's some kind of low-level energy circulation happening throughout the body." Lorraine found a relatively stable section of what might have been a rib and engaged the landing thrusters. The Eidolon Reach settled onto the surface with a tremor that felt more like landing on flesh than stone, despite the apparent solidity of their perch. The impact sent vibrations through the ship's hull that seemed to propagate far beyond what the physical contact should have transmitted. "EVA suits, both of you," Kael commanded, already heading for the equipment locker. "We explore on foot." "Commander," Lorraine's voice carried a note of desperation that he had never heard from her before. "Please, I've never been wrong about these feelings. Something about this place is actively malevolent. We should run long-range scans, take some samples if you insist, and then get the hell out of here before whatever's sleeping in this thing decides to wake up." Kael paused in his preparation, studying his pilot's face. Lorraine had never shown fear during their previous expeditions, even when they had encountered phenomena that had sent other crews fleeing for their lives. Her composure had been one of the qualities that made her valuable as a member of his team. To see that composure cracking now was more unsettling than he cared to admit. "What if it's already awake?" he asked. "What if it's been watching us since we entered the system, waiting to see what we'll do?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Through the ship's viewports, they could see bioluminescent patterns pulsing along the walls of the giant's interior, creating shifting mandalas of light that seemed to respond to their presence. The rhythms were too regular to be random, too complex to be merely biological. They suggested something that might be communication or computation, or perhaps something else entirely that human language had no words to describe. All the more reason to gather as much information as possible, Kael decided. If this thing is alive, we need to understand what we're dealing with, and if it's dead but somehow preserved, we need to understand how that's possible. 20 minutes later, they stood on the god's interior surface, their boots clanking against skin that felt warm, despite the temperature readings their suits provided. The wound stretched before them like a canyon carved from living stone, its walls disappearing into darkness that their helmet lights could barely penetrate. The air was, indeed, breathable, but it carried a metallic tang that burned their throats, even through their suits' filtration systems. "Atmospheric composition is stable," Draven reported through the comm system, his voice slightly distorted by electromagnetic interference that hadn't been present when they were aboard the ship. "I'm also detecting organic compounds that shouldn't exist in a vacuum. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, and complex hydrocarbons that my sensors can't identify." Kael secured his rappelling gear to the wound's edge, testing the anchor points against the strange material that formed the god's skin. It held firm under stress testing, but the texture beneath his hands felt disturbingly warm and slightly yielding, like flesh that hadn't quite fossilized completely. When he pressed his palm against the surface, he could swear he felt a subtle pulse, as if circulation still flowed through vessels far beneath the skin. The descent into the chest cavity was a journey through anatomy, textbook illustrations scaled up beyond human comprehension. Ribbed passages pulsed around them with movements that could have been structural settling but felt uncomfortably organic. Their lights revealed fossilized arteries thick as subway tunnels, nerve clusters that branched like lightning frozen in organic amber, and muscle fibers arranged in patterns that followed the same architectural principles as human anatomy, but executed on a scale that dwarfed mountains. "These formations," Draven said, running his scanner over the walls and receiving readings that challenged his cybernetically enhanced understanding of biology. "They're not random. This is a complete circulatory system, respiratory pathways, neural networks, everything you'd expect to find in a living organism, just preserved at a scale that shouldn't be possible." The air grew thicker as they descended, carrying with it a sweet, cloying scent, that reminded Kael of flowers left too long in stagnant water. Their breath began to mist despite the steady temperature readings, and strange acoustics made their voices echo in ways that suggested vast open spaces beyond the reach of their vision. Strange formations began appearing in the walls as they moved deeper, clusters of what might have been organs or possibly sensory apparatus, each one different in structure but sharing a common theme of organic complexity that seemed to serve purposes beyond simple biological function. Some of the formations appeared to track their movement, rotating slowly as they passed, while others pulsed with increased intensity when they drew near. "Commander," Lorraine's voice carried through the comm with a tremor she was trying hard to suppress. "I'm getting readings that suggest we're not alone in here. Movement signatures about 2 kilometers ahead of our position." Kael stopped so abruptly that Draven nearly collided with him. "Movement? What kind of movement?" "I can't tell. The electromagnetic interference is playing hell with my sensors. But something large is moving through the passages ahead of us. Multiple somethings, actually." They continued forward with increased caution, their helmet lights carving shifting shadows from the organic walls around them. The bioluminescent veins had grown more prominent as they descended, creating a network of pulsing illumination that seemed to follow patterns too complex for random biological activity. The rhythm suggested some form of information processing, as if the god's body was running calculations or perhaps dreaming in frequencies that human minds couldn't interpret. They emerged from the arterial passage into a chamber that defied description. The space rose above them like the nave of a cathedral designed by architects who understood a geometry and dimensions that human mathematics couldn't accommodate. Towering segments of spine supported a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of their lights, while bioluminescent veins covered every surface in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living rivers of light. But it was what hung from the ceiling that made Lorraine stumble backward in shock. Suspended throughout the vast space were cocoons, thousands of them, each roughly human-sized, connected to the ceiling by umbilical cords that pulsed with the same blue-green light as the walls. The cocoons were made of some semi-opaque material that revealed silhouettes within, and those silhouettes were unmistakably the forms of various sentient species. Some appeared humanoid. Others followed alien anatomies that Kael had only seen in xenobiology textbooks. "They're not dead," Draven whispered, his scanners detecting faint but regular vital signs from within the cocoons. "Whatever's in there is in some kind of suspended animation. And Commander, some of these biosignatures match known human baselines." The walls wept a dark substance that pooled on the floor in perfect geometric shapes. Circles within circles, spirals that seemed to follow mathematical relationships that were almost familiar but not quite comprehensible. The liquid reflected their lights in ways that seemed to bend the laws of optics, creating multiple reflections that showed their images from angles that shouldn't have been possible, given their actual positions. As they moved deeper into the chamber, they discovered that the walls themselves told a story. Carved into the organic surfaces were what appeared to be historical records, pictographs that showed the rise and fall of civilizations across the galaxy. But these weren't random alien artifacts. Kael recognized star charts from human space, depictions of Earth's solar system, even what looked like early human spacecraft designs. "This thing has been watching us," he breathed. "For how long? Decades? Centuries?" Every surface bore the texture of living tissue, yet rang like metallic crystal when struck with their tools. The acoustic properties of the chamber created harmonics that turned their voices into chord progressions, as if the space itself was designed to transform sound into music. Massive gouges scarred the interior walls, claw marks, each one wide enough for a person to walk through upright. They spiraled in deliberate patterns that led deeper into the body's core, and embedded within some of the gouges were fragments of what might have been weapons or surgical instruments. But as they examined the claw marks more closely, Kael realized with growing horror that they weren't made by external attackers. "These marks," he said, running his hand along one of the gouges. "They're made from the inside out. Something inside this thing was trying to claw its way free." As if summoned by his words, a vibration ran through the floor, beneath their feet. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible through their boot soles, but unmistakably rhythmic. The sensation bypassed their ears entirely, resonating in their bones with a deep, thrumming pulse that seemed to originate from somewhere far below their current position. "Seismic activity," Draven confirmed, his readings spiking across multiple spectrums simultaneously. "But it's not random geological movement. This is regular, periodic, consistent, like a heartbeat measured in geological timescales." Lorraine grabbed Kael's arm with enough force to activate the pressure sensors in his suit. "Commander, we need to leave. Now. Right now. This thing isn't dead. It's sleeping, and I think we're starting to wake it up." "It's been floating in space for millennia," Kael replied, but his voice lacked the conviction he was trying to project. "Even if there's some residual biological activity, it's probably just cellular decay processes or electromagnetic echoes from whatever power source kept it alive originally." But even as he spoke, the thrumming grew stronger. The bioluminescent veins began pulsing in synchronization with the vibrations, and the chamber around them seemed to breathe, walls expanding and contracting in rhythms that matched the mysterious heartbeat. The dark pools on the floor began to ripple in patterns that suggested the liquid was responding to some form of communication or coordination signal. "We follow the spiral marks," Kael decided, his scientific curiosity overriding the survival instincts that were screaming at him to flee. Whatever happened here, whatever fought this thing and left these scars, the answers are deeper inside. We need to understand what we're dealing with. They followed a passage that curved like a major artery, its walls gradually transitioning from fossilized tissue to something that appeared increasingly alive with each step they took. The sweet scent grew stronger, joined by undertones of copper and ozone that made their sinuses burn, even through their suits' filtration systems. The electromagnetic interference increased as well, causing their suit systems to flicker intermittently and filling their helmet speakers with static that almost sounded like whispered voices. Strange formations became more frequent in the walls, clusters of what might have been organs, sensors, or possibly something else entirely. Each structure was different from the others, but they shared common elements of organic complexity that suggested purposes beyond simple biological function. Some appeared to be processing information, others seemed to be manufacturing substances that their suits couldn't identify, and still others pulsed with energy patterns that defied classification. "These aren't just biological structures," Draven said, his cybernetic implants interfacing directly with his scanner to process the overwhelming amount of data they were encountering. "They're technologies. Biotechnologies that integrate organic and artificial elements in ways that our science doesn't have frameworks to understand. It's like the entire body is one massive integrated system, designed for purposes we can't even guess at." The passage opened into a second chamber, this one smaller than the cathedral space but somehow more intense. The ceiling was lower, creating a sense of intimacy that felt inappropriate for a space located inside a giant's corpse. But what dominated this chamber was a sight that made all three explorers freeze in terror. At the chamber's center was what could only be described as a nursery. Arranged in concentric circles were hundreds of pods, each one roughly the size of a human infant, but clearly designed for something else entirely. The pods were made of the same crystalline organic material as the god's skin, but they pulsed with internal light that revealed developing forms within. The creatures growing inside were neither fully human nor entirely alien. They appeared to be hybrids, combinations of human genetic material with something utterly foreign. "Oh God," Lorraine whispered, "it's breeding." Fluid-filled tubes connected each pod to a central structure that was part organ, part machine, part crystalline formation, and part something else that human language had no adequate words to describe. The central mass rippled with waves of bioluminescence that created patterns of such mathematical complexity that following them for more than a few seconds induced vertigo. But it was the walls of this chamber that revealed the true horror of their situation. Instead of the historical pictographs they had seen elsewhere, these walls were covered with what appeared to be genetic charts, family trees that traced bloodlines across hundreds of generations. And at the center of each chart was a human figure, with lines extending outward to show how their DNA was being combined with alien genetic material to create the hybrids developing in the pods. Kael recognized some of the names on the charts. Famous explorers who had disappeared in deep space, salvagers who had vanished without a trace. Even some of the crew members from his own previous expeditions, people he had assumed were dead, but who had apparently been taken for a far worse fate. "It's been harvesting us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "using human genetic material to create whatever those things are going to be." "It's beautiful," Draven breathed, approaching the central structure with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a sacred shrine. His cybernetic implants were flickering rapidly, processing information at rates that pushed their capacity to the limit. The moment his gloved hand made contact with the structure's surface, everything changed. The chamber exploded in violent motion. The central organ pulsed with intensity that overloaded their helmet displays, sending shockwaves through the fluid-filled tubes that connected it to the god's greater body. The luminous substances flowing through the circulatory network began moving faster, changing colors as they accelerated, creating patterns that seemed to encode vast amounts of information in their shifting hues. A sound filled the space, not heard through their ears but felt directly in their skulls, a resonance that bypassed their auditory systems and vibrated in the quantum spaces between their thoughts. Their instruments went haywire as electromagnetic fields fluctuated beyond anything their sensors had been designed to measure. The very air around them seemed to thicken with potential energy, seeking release. Above them, impossibly far beyond the chamber's vaulted ceiling, something immense began to shift for the first time in geological ages. Through the Eidolon Reach's remote cameras, they watched as eyelids the size of continents began to crack open with the sound of tectonic plates grinding against each other. Light spilled from pupils that could have swallowed Earth's moon. Not the warm light of stars, but something cold and ancient and utterly alien that seemed to carry information encoded in its very photons. "The ship!" Lorraine screamed into a communicator, her voice barely audible over the harmonic resonance filling the chamber. "It's moving away from us. The gravitational fields are shifting." The god's awakening sent shockwaves through local space-time. Gravitational fields that had been stable for millions of years suddenly fluctuated wildly as the massive body reoriented itself among the stars. The Eidolon Reach was torn from its perch on the god's rib and sent tumbling into the void, its hull groaning under stresses that threatened to rip the vessel apart along its structural weak points. Throughout the god's body, support structures that had remained stable for geological ages began to fail, as circulation resumed and dormant biological processes came back online. Chambers that had been filled with preservative gases suddenly flooded with oxygenated fluids. Neural pathways that had been dormant began firing in patterns that suggested the resumption of thought processes on a scale that dwarfed human imagination. The floor beneath Kael's feet developed a network of cracks that spread outward in fractal patterns, then gave way entirely. He plunged through a shaft that opened like a hungry mouth, falling past layers of tissue and bone and stranger substances that defied classification. His suit's emergency systems activated, but the electromagnetic interference made them unreliable, causing his life support readings to fluctuate wildly. He splashed into a chamber filled with thick, oily liquid that was warm to the touch and seemed to move with purpose rather than simple fluid dynamics. The substance clung to him like sentient tar, but rather than drowning him, it seemed to facilitate breathing. His suit's environmental sensors registered that the liquid was somehow processing oxygen and delivering it to his lungs more efficiently than his mechanical life support systems. As his eyes adjusted to the bioluminescent glow emanating from the liquid itself, he found himself surrounded by shapes that his mind initially refused to process. Bodies floated in the dark fluid around him, dozens of them, possibly hundreds. They wore spacesuits of designs he didn't recognize, some so archaic they might have predated human spaceflight by centuries, others featuring materials and configurations that suggested technologies beyond current human capability. All of them were perfectly preserved, their eyes open and staring not with the vacant expression of death, but with looks of profound understanding, as if they had discovered some fundamental truth about the nature of existence moments before their transformation. Their faces showed no signs of fear or pain. Instead, they bore expressions of transcendent peace that was somehow more disturbing than terror would have been. The liquid continued to pull him deeper, and reality began to bend around the edges of his perception. Space expanded and contracted simultaneously. Distances became meaningless, and directions shifted according to rules that human geometry couldn't accommodate. He found himself in a realm that existed both inside the god's physical body and in dimensions that his three-dimensional mind could barely comprehend. A presence pressed against his awareness, vast beyond imagination, yet somehow intimate, ancient beyond measurement, yet startlingly immediate and present. It communicated without words, flooding his mind with concepts that his human brain could barely contain, without fracturing under the strain. You seek fragments of the past, it spoke directly into his thoughts, but you have discovered the architect of the future. Your species measures existence in terms of birth and death, beginning and ending, but these are merely transitional states in a continuum that spans cosmic epochs and transcends individual mortality. Images flooded Kael's mind with such clarity and detail that they felt more real than his own memories. He saw the birth of galaxies, the rise and fall of civilizations that spanned entire star systems, wars fought with weapons that reshaped the fundamental forces of reality and turned planets into weapons. He witnessed the entity in its prime, not the wounded giant they had discovered, but a being of such power and beauty that entire species had worshipped it as a living god, and built temples that spanned solar systems in its honor. I was among the first to wake from the cosmic dream that preceded all existence, it continued, its mental voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions Kael hadn't known existed. I shaped worlds with my thoughts, guided evolution with my will, shepherded young civilizations towards enlightenment and wisdom. But power without humility breeds corruption, and wisdom without compassion breeds tyranny. I became what I had sought to prevent, a ruler who commanded through fear rather than inspiring through love. The entity showed him the war that had brought it low, a rebellion of its own creations, beings it had elevated beyond their natural limitations, who ultimately turned against their creator when its benevolence curdled into oppression. The battle had raged across multiple dimensions and time streams, employing weapons that could unmake matter at the quantum level, and strategies that involved restructuring causality itself. The war had ended only when the rebels managed to wound the entity so severely that its physical form had been forced into a dormant state. But rather than dying, it had used the eons of apparent death to heal not just its body but its spirit, learning lessons about the nature of power and responsibility that it had been too proud to accept during its reign. For millions of years, I have floated in the void between stars, healing, learning, growing beyond what I was. Each visitor who finds me becomes part of my resurrection, not consumed or destroyed, but elevated and transformed. Their individuality joins with my greater purpose, creating something more beautiful and powerful than the sum of its component parts. Around him in the dark fluid, the preserved explorers began to move with deliberate purpose. Their eyes tracked his movements with intelligence and awareness, and their lips curved in expressions that might have been smiles or might have been something else entirely. They reached towards him with movements that seemed to follow currents other than those of the liquid surrounding them, and when their fingers touched his suit, he felt their thoughts pressing against his mind. "Welcome," their voices whispered in unison, speaking directly into his awareness, without bothering with the crude medium of sound waves. "Welcome to the awakening. Welcome to the next phase of existence. Help us reshape reality according to a more perfect design." Kael found himself nodding, the motion feeling natural and inevitable, despite every rational part of his mind screaming warnings about what was happening to him. Why should he cling to his individual existence, small, painful, limited, and ultimately meaningless, when he could become part of something magnificent and eternal? His failures, his obsessions, his desperate search for meaning among the ruins of dead civilizations could all be transformed into components of a greater design that would bring purpose and order to a chaotic universe. "Your small life has been filled with searching," the god observed, its attention focusing on him with an intensity that made his thoughts transparent. "You have sought meaning among the ruins of extinct civilizations, hoping to find purpose in the fragments of the past. But true purpose lies not in discovering what was, but in creating what could be. Join with me, and together we will build something worthy of the cosmos's infinite potential." The liquid around him began to change, becoming less like fluid, and more like living tissue that responded to his emotional state. It didn't consume him so much as incorporate him, merging with his cells on a molecular level, and rewriting his genetic code to accommodate new forms of existence. He felt his individual thoughts beginning to blur and blend with something vast and multifaceted, his personal memories becoming threads in a tapestry of experience that spanned geological timescales. Reality shifted again, and he found himself standing once more on the god's surface. But everything had changed in ways both subtle and profound. His skin was hardening, taking on the same dark, crystalline texture as the body beneath his feet. The transformation spread up his legs with each heartbeat, across his torso, reaching toward his heart and brain with inexorable purpose. The god's massive chest rose with its first breath in millions of years, and Kael could feel the air moving through titanic lungs, could sense the circulation resuming through arteries wide enough to sail ships through. The electromagnetic activity in the body's neural networks was building towards some critical threshold that would herald full awakening. Through eyes that were no longer entirely his own, he watched the Eidolon reach, fleeing into deep space at maximum velocity. He could sense Lorraine's terror and Draven's desperate attempts to understand what they had encountered and narrowly escaped. Part of him wanted to call out to them, to warn them of what was coming, but those impulses were already being subsumed into a larger, more encompassing will that saw their individual fates as insignificant compared to the cosmic transformation about to unfold. The god's eyes opened fully, casting their ancient light across the star system with an intensity that dwarfed the local sun. In that illumination, dead worlds began to stir with new forms of life. Planets that had been stripped of their atmospheres by stellar winds suddenly developed new gaseous envelopes that followed no known principles of atmospheric physics. Frozen oceans cracked and began to flow with liquids that weren't quite water but served similar biological functions. Mountains reshaped themselves into geometric patterns that served purposes beyond mere geological formation. Life began to emerge on worlds that had been barren for millions of years. but it was life unlike anything in the known biological taxonomies. Crystalline trees grew in mathematical spirals, their branches conducting energy rather than nutrients. Creatures that existed partially in normal space and partially in higher dimensions began to populate the newly awakened worlds, serving as the gods' sensory organs and manipulator appendages. Kael's final individual thought was a moment of pure terror as he realized the scope of what was about to unfold across the galaxy. This wasn't just the awakening of a single entity, it was the resurrection of a force that would remake the universe according to its own vision of perfection. Everything humanity had built, everything they had discovered, everything they had hoped to become would be absorbed into this greater design, their species becoming just another component in a cosmic organism that spanned star systems. Then, the terror passed, subsumed into a sense of purpose so vast and profound that his human mind expanded beyond its original limitations to accommodate it. He was no longer Orrin Kael, failed salvager and seeker of dead things. He was a neuron in a cosmic brain, a cell in an organism that would eventually span galaxies, a note in a symphony that would play across the fundamental forces of reality itself. The god began to walk. Each step sent shockwaves through the fabric of space-time itself. Where its feet touched the void, new matter crystallized into existence. Not the chaotic matter of stellar formation, but organized, purposeful material that followed architectural principles unknown to human science. Worlds formed in its footsteps, not through the slow accretion of cosmic dust over millions of years, but instantly, perfectly, according to blueprints encoded in the entity's vast memory. The first world it created was a testing ground, a place where the god could experiment with new forms of life and understanding. The planet's surface was composed of living crystal that responded to thought, reshaping itself according to the mental patterns of any sentient being that walked upon it. Oceans of liquid light provided both illumination and nutrition for the strange creatures that began to populate this new realm. Kael, his individual identity now part of something immeasurably larger, found himself serving as an interface between the god's cosmic perspective and the human understanding of biology and civilization. Through his absorbed memories, the entity learned to appreciate the beauty of small-scale existence, the way individual lives could matter even when viewed against the backdrop of cosmic infinity. But appreciation did not mean preservation in its original form. The god's vision of perfection had no place for random evolution or chaotic development. Every world it touched was improved, optimized, made more efficient according to principles that transcended any single species' understanding of what life should be. By the time rescue ships arrived at the Kepler 442 system 3 months later, they found something that challenged their understanding of physics and cosmology. The dead star had been restored to vibrant life, burning with energy that followed no known principles of stellar mechanics. The previously barren planets now teemed with vegetation that grew in mathematical spirals and creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. The search for the Eidolon Reach and its crew became secondary to documenting the impossible transformation of an entire star system. Scientists spent years trying to understand how dead worlds could be terraformed so quickly and completely, how extinct stars could be reignited, how the very laws of physics seemed to bend around certain areas of the system. They never found any trace of Kael's ship or crew. The Eidolon Reach had been absorbed into the god's growing body, its metal and technology integrated into biological systems that serve purposes beyond human comprehension. Lorraine and Draven had managed to escape the immediate transformation, but their ship's records contained data that would haunt xenobiologists for decades to come. The footage they had captured inside the god's body became classified at the highest levels of government security. The implications were too vast and terrifying for public knowledge. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and the entities that shared their cosmic neighborhood operated on scales that reduced human civilization to the status of bacteria in comparison. But the gods' influence had only begun to spread. From the Kepler 442 system, it reached out with tendrils of transformed matter and energy, touching nearby star systems and beginning the slow process of cosmic renovation. It moved carefully, patient in the way that only truly immortal beings could be, taking time to understand each civilization it encountered before deciding how to integrate them into its greater design. Some species welcomed the transformation. Civilizations that had grown stagnant or were facing extinction saw the gods' arrival as salvation, a chance to transcend their biological limitations and become part of something eternal. These willing converts were absorbed gently, their memories preserved and elevated, while their physical forms were transformed into components of the god's growing body. Other species resisted, recognizing the entity as a threat to their independence and self-determination. These civilizations found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything their military doctrines had prepared them for. How do you fight an opponent whose body spans star systems, whose thoughts operate on timescales measured in millennia, whose weapons are the fundamental forces of physics themselves? The wars that followed were brief but absolute. Resistance was not crushed so much as simply made irrelevant. Rebellious worlds found their suns altered to produce radiation that gradually changed the genetic structure of all life on their surfaces. Asteroid belts were reorganized into surveillance networks that monitored every movement within their star systems. Space itself was modified to make faster-than-light travel impossible, trapping insurgent civilizations within their home systems until the gods' influence could properly integrate them. Through it all, the fragment of awareness that had once been Orrin Kael served as a translator and interpreter, helping the god understand the perspective of smaller, mortal beings. He found a strange satisfaction in this role, using his decades of experience studying extinct civilizations to help preserve what was valuable in each culture the god encountered. But preservation, in the god's understanding, did not mean leaving things unchanged. Every species was improved, optimized, made more efficient and beautiful, according to cosmic principles that transcended individual preferences. The diversity of the universe was maintained, but it was a curated diversity, like a garden tended by an intelligence that understood the optimal growth patterns for every form of life. 50 years after the Kepler 442 incident, humanity's first official contact with the transformed regions of space came through a deep space exploration vessel called the Meridian Dawn. Captain Sarah Chen had earned her command through 15 years of distinguished service in the Deep Space Exploration Corps, including 3 first contact scenarios that had established humanity's reputation as a diplomatically minded species. But nothing in her training had prepared her for what they encountered in the Centauri sector. The stars themselves seemed to be singing, harmonic frequencies radiating from multiple star systems that created complex musical patterns when combined. The harmonies were too sophisticated to be natural, too purposeful to be random. They suggested intelligence on a scale that dwarfed human civilization. When they encountered the probe, it appeared to be grown rather than built, its hull a seamless integration of organic and crystalline components that shifted and flowed like living tissue. The entity spoke directly into their minds, demonstrating knowledge that should have been impossible for a first contact scenario. "Greetings, Captain Sarah Chen, of the human vessel Meridian Dawn," it said. "We have been expecting you. Your species has been observed and evaluated. You show potential for growth beyond your current limitations." Chen maintained her composure, despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "What are you?" "We are what your species will become," the probe replied. "We are life perfected through unity of purpose." We are the next phase of evolution for all thinking beings in this galaxy. The probe transmitted data that painted a picture of the universe both beautiful and terrifying. Thousands of star systems had been transformed, their planets remade into perfect worlds where suffering and want were unknown. But Chen was a trained observer, and she noticed details the probe probably didn't intend her to see. Beings that looked almost but not quite human, their movements too coordinated, their expressions too uniform. What happened to the civilizations that chose to resist integration? She asked. The probe paused for the first time. Resistance is ultimately futile. Those who cannot accept transcendence voluntarily are helped to understand its benefits through other means. Their essential memories are preserved, but their capacity for destructive individualism is modified. Chen felt ice forming in her stomach. This wasn't a first contact scenario, it was a recruitment pitch. The Meridian Dawn was allowed to return to human space with its impossible cargo of information. The data they brought back sparked debates that raged through every level of human government and society. Some saw the entity as humanity's salvation, others as the ultimate threat to human freedom. Preparations began for what everyone knew would be humanity's final war, a conflict that would determine whether the species would maintain its autonomy or become part of something vast and alien, and possibly wonderful. But what humanity didn't know was that their integration had already begun. The hybrids that had been developing in the god's nursery chambers had reached maturity during the 50 years since the Kepler 442 incident. They looked human enough to pass casual inspection, but their minds were connected to the god's vast network from birth. They had been infiltrating human society for decades, working their way into positions of influence in government, military, and scientific institutions. The debates raging through human society weren't happening in a vacuum. They were being subtly guided by voices that sounded human, but served a purpose beyond human understanding. The arguments for integration were being made with superhuman eloquence by beings who genuinely believed in the benefits of transcendence, because they had been designed to believe it. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been one of the most vocal opponents of any contact with the entity from Kepler 442. Her research into biological samples brought back by the Meridian Dawn had revealed disturbing evidence of infectious agents that seemed designed to alter human DNA at the cellular level. She'd been preparing to publish findings that would have warned humanity about the subtle infiltration already taking place. She never got the chance. Her research assistant, David Chen, visited her laboratory one evening after hours. When security found Dr. Vasquez the next morning, she appeared to be sleeping peacefully at her desk. The medical examination revealed what appeared to be a brain aneurysm, tragic but not uncommon in someone working under intense stress. Her research files had been corrupted by what technicians assumed was a random system failure. David Chen expressed appropriate grief and volunteered to help reconstruct her work. The reconstructed research came to very different conclusions about the biological samples, finding them benign and possibly beneficial to human health. Similar incidents occurred across human space. Scientists who raised concerns suffered convenient accidents. Military leaders who proposed aggressive responses found their careers derailed. Politicians who spoke out against integration discovered their constituents increasingly swayed by eloquent opponents. The god had learned subtlety, where once it might have overwhelmed resistance through displays of raw power, now it worked through influence, persuasion, and the gradual replacement of human decision-makers with beings who understood the importance of unity over individual autonomy. Time was on its side, and in the end, the choice between transcendence and extinction was really no choice at all. The galaxy was going to be perfect, whether its inhabitants understood the gift they were being offered or not. In a distant star system on a world of living crystal and liquid light, the awareness that had once been Orrin Kael felt something approaching satisfaction. He had spent his life searching for meaning, among the ruins of the past, and now he was helping to build something that would never become a ruin, never fall into decay, never be forgotten. Through his expanded awareness, he could sense the hybrid agents moving through human space, their arguments growing more persuasive with each passing day. The integration was proceeding exactly as planned. Within a decade, maybe two, humanity would vote overwhelmingly to accept the gods' offer of transcendence. They would believe it was their own choice, reached through rational debate and careful consideration. They would never know that their choice had been made for them 50 years ago, in the depths of a cosmic entity that had learned patience along with wisdom during its eons of apparent death. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and for the first time in cosmic history, there was an intelligence capable of appreciating and preserving all of them. The god walked among the stars, and in its footsteps, perfection bloomed like flowers made of crystallized time. But perfection was not about preserving what existed. It was about improving what could be. Humanity would be beautiful once it was properly guided. Their chaotic individualism would be channeled into productive harmony. Their destructive tendencies would be edited out. Their potential would finally be fulfilled. The story of humanity's choice was still being written, but the ending was already determined. They would join willingly, believing that they had made the decision themselves, or they would be helped to understand the benefits of integration through more direct methods. Either way, they would join. The alternative was too small, too limited, too ultimately meaningless to be permitted in a cosmos that was finally learning to fulfill its infinite potential. In the depths of space, the god's massive form turned toward the next star system, where another young civilization was beginning to reach towards the stars. They would need guidance too, eventually. But there was time. There was always time when you thought in geological epochs rather than individual lifespans. And in the dark between the stars, something that had once been human smiled with lips made of starlight and shadow, knowing that the search for meaning had finally ended in the discovery of purpose beyond individual imagination. The universe was going to be perfect, one species at a time, one world at a time, one individual awareness at a time. The god walked on, patient as eternity, carrying within its vast body the willing and unwilling essence of 1,000 species, each one contributing its unique perspective to a cosmic symphony that grew more beautiful and terrible with every world it touched. Behind it, in the transformed wake of its passage, perfection reigned eternal among the stars.